It's 10 Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific. I'm Ana Cabrera reporting from New York. Let's get right to that breaking news. Just moments ago, a federal judge denying the Justice Department's bid to unseal grand jury records from the criminal case against Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's accomplice, noting in part that the materials do not identify anyone other than Epstein or Maxwell who had sexual contact with a minor. And joining us now for more on this is MSNBC's Ken Dilanian and former federal prosecutor Barrett Berger. So, Ken, break this down for us. What are we hearing from this judge?
This was a resounding ruling, Anna, totally repudiating the Justice Department's request to unseal these transcripts, really saying that there are no special circumstances here and it's not in the public interest to violate grand jury secrecy by throwing this stuff out to the public, in part because the judge said these materials would reveal nothing new. They're basically a summary of things that are already in the public record from the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell. I'll just read from one of the passages here. A member of the public familiar with the Maxwell trial record, the judge wrote, who reviewed these grand jury materials would learn next to nothing new. He said they do not reveal new venues at which their crimes occurred. They do not reveal new sources of their wealth. He's talking about Epstein and Maxwell. They do not explore the circumstances of Epstein's death, and they do not reveal the path of the government investigation. He further said there's no client list in here. As you said, there's no allegation that anyone else had sexual contact with minors. And he is saying that really the only decent legal argument to release these transcripts, this was remarkable, is that it would show that the Justice Department's argument for doing so was totally disingenuous and may have been more about distraction than transparency. Those are the words of a federal judge, Anna.
And so, Bear, what's your reaction to this?
I'm not surprised by this, Anna. It is a very high threshold to unseal grand jury materials for good reason. We make this promise to witnesses that testify in the grand jury that these are secret proceedings. And so it really has to be a high public need for these kinds of documents to become public. The judge here very clearly found there was not. The public being interested in the story just doesn't meet what the statute requires. What's interesting to me is that a lot of the arguments that DOJ made at the end about why these documents should be released, the judge actually seemed to say support them not being released. DOJ was saying much of this material was already made public during trial, so really what's the harm of releasing it? The judge flipping that right back, saying actually, because this material was largely made public during a very lengthy trial, now there is no need to take this extraordinary step of unsealing these records. So it's not surprising, but I'm sure for many people it will be disappointing.
Yeah, one of the things that stood out in this ruling, as we continue to read through this on page 21, so it's a lengthy ruling, he writes of the Maxwell grand jury testimony that this is not a matter of significant historical or public interest. Far from it. It consists of garden variety summary testimony by two law enforcement agents, and the information it contains is already almost entirely a matter of long-standing public record. I mean, Barrett, wouldn't the DOJ have already known this when they asked to have these transcripts made public?
They would have obviously reviewed these documents. And that's what many of us who worked as federal prosecutors have been saying. Grand jury proceedings, by and large, are not as, sexy as many people may think they are. Usually it's not hundreds of witnesses that are testifying for the grand jury. It's one, maybe two case agents that testify, often putting in, large summaries of documents that they've reviewed or people that they've spoken to. Hearsay testimony is allowed in the grand jury, so that's why federal prosecutors are often able to only call one or two case agents as their witnesses. So the federal prosecutors here would have certainly reviewed these documents. They knew what was in them. Again, this may be some type of, trying to serve the client here, saying the client really wants these to be public and we're getting a lot of pressure, so let's make the motion. But definitely they would have known the substance and known that there wasn't anything so groundbreaking in them.
And so, Ken, we know there's a separate judge considering unsealing documents as well. Could that still happen?
Look, there's every reason to believe that this judge, the judge in the Epstein case, who's considering a similar request, will come to the exact same conclusions, because that was also a summary witness grand jury. Neither of these were investigative grand juries where they called witnesses. These were, again, this was an FBI agent going for one day and explaining to the grand jury why there was probable cause to believe a crime was committed, why they should return an indictment. Look, to the extent that there is interesting or titillating information in the FBI files in the Epstein case, they're probably not in this grand jury material. They may still be buried in FBI files somewhere. Things like, files with Donald Trump's name on them or other people's names on them. But like the FBI gathers a vast amount of material in a criminal investigation, and it stays secret for a reason. It is really invasive of people's privacy. It makes unsupported allegations that were never aired in court. That's why it's secret. So the idea that the government would air all that out to satisfy conspiracy theories about that unfounded about the Epstein case, I just don't see that happening at the moment.
And of course, we don't want to forget all of the abuse survivors who also weighed in wanting some of these transcripts and records to be unsealed. And the judge writes about that, Barrett. The victim's interest in reviewing the grand jury materials appears to be premised on the understandable but mistaken belief that these materials would reveal new information. Had the government's motion made clear that these records are redundant of the evidence at Maxwell's public trial, the victim's responses to the motion to unseal might well have been different. So, as we've discussed, this is not unexpected necessarily, since it was just these two witnesses who would be involved in the transcript specifically. But Barrett, what about the other exhibits that were presented to these grand juries? Other documents, police files, interviews, recordings. Could that still be revelatory?
It could be. The judge seems to think that's unlikely. But, Anna, the judge points out something that I think gets lost in a lot of these discussions, which is, this has been so traumatic for the victims from day one, not only based on everything they went through, but having to live through a trial and now having all of this information essentially relitigated and brought back up. The victims here very often not getting a clear story about, what they're entitled to, what could be in there. So it's this real series of ups and downs, them thinking, maybe we'll learn something new, maybe we won't. What's missing here is any sense of closure for these victims. That's one of the reasons why grand jury proceedings, are so difficult to get unsealed. It's one of the reasons why we have finality in court proceedings, because there should be some type of closure and ending for victims. The victims in this case certainly have not gotten anything close to that yet.
In Washington, D.C., homicides are down 32%. Robberies are down 39%. Armed carjackings are down 53%. Assaults with a dangerous weapon are down 27%. In Washington, D.C., the rates of burglaries and assaults with a dangerous weapon are at their lowest point in 30 years. Nevertheless, because he's so tough on crime, President Trump today deployed hundreds of National Guardsmen and women into Washington, D.C. Send the U.S. military to become the police force in Washington, D.C. The lead in the Washington Post tonight, quote, President Donald Trump announced today that he is placing the D.C. police under direct federal control and will deploy the National Guard to the streets of Washington, an extraordinary flex of federal power that strips city leadership of its ability to make law enforcement decisions and could expose residents of the nation's capital to unpredictable encounters with a domestically deployed military force. A domestically deployed military force. Because tough on crime. You think it's really about crime? You think it's really about being tough on crime? Do you want to maybe track down the axe and machete triple murderer Trump just released to the streets of Orlando to go ask him if he thinks it's about being tough on crime? Or you maybe want to pop in to ask Ghislaine at that Bureau of Prisons crown jewel facility that kind of looks like a community college? You want to go ask her? Think it's because he's so tough on crime? That said, let's be generous here. Maybe it's not really just a generic tough on crime thing. Maybe it's specifically because it's D.C., which is the seat of the U.S. federal government. So even for a city enjoying a 30-year low in violent crime, maybe that's still just an intolerable amount of crime, specifically because it's D.C., and D.C. is where the federal government is, and maybe he's just really sensitive about protecting the federal government. Maybe he's really sensitive and really focused when it comes to protecting the seat of the federal government from any kind of crime. January 6th, no, forget about that. He's just sensitive about it now. Maybe that's it. Well, let's see. Today's Monday. On Friday, this happened. a sustained violent attack on the headquarters of the federal government Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. See all those little pockmarks, those little holes? Those are bullet holes in the CDC. The gunman reportedly tried to get into the CDC headquarters in Atlanta. Security guards turned him away. He then drove to a nearby business, a nearby pharmacy, and took up a shooting position there. The Associated Press reports today that the man fired more than 180 shots into the headquarters of the Centers for Disease Control. More than 180 shots fired. He was found with 5 guns, including 4 long guns, and bullets that he fired at the CDC broke at least 150 windows. The bullets pierced blast-resistant windows in multiple buildings and spat glass shards into multiple offices. 1 police officer was killed. The gunman died as well. It's not clear if he shot himself or was shot by law enforcement. It is a miracle, obviously, that CDC personnel other than the police officer protecting them were not killed. The head of the agency that includes the CDC, Donald Trump's Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy, posted this online after the shooting. Then he posted this one as well. This is what he was posting the day after the shooting at the CDC, when a gunman fired more than 180 bullets into the headquarters of the Centers for Disease Control. This was the reaction of the man in charge of that agency. This was his response. It wasn't until later and after he finished posting his fishing pictures that he got around to expressing condolences for the, shooting or whatever. This major attack on a federal government facility, again, 180 shots fired into the CDC. This major attack on a federal government facility has so far garnered no response whatsoever from President Donald Trump, let alone an armed response into Atlanta, where the CDC headquarters is. But he did send in the National Guard to Washington, D.C. today because tough on crime, you think? Maybe it's not about crime. Maybe it's not about defending the federal government from threats, right? Maybe it's not about that. Maybe it's not about crime. Maybe it's not about any other thing he might voice. Maybe it's what you can see with your own 2 eyes. Maybe it's that he really enjoys using U.S. military force against American civilians on American soil and wants any excuse to do it anywhere he can. Watch what they do, not what they say. Because, given what else he's done on the issue of crime, does it make sense that him sending in the troops for a military takeover of Washington, D.C. is about crime? That's what he said. But what do you think based on what he's done? Because meanwhile, while he's talking about crime, he has sent in the National Guard and active duty U.S. Marines to Los Angeles as well, right? Supposedly to save that city from protests against him. That deployment was so inexplicable and so palpably disconnected from its purported justifications that the LA Times reported on a spike in calls to the GI Rights hotline, with military personnel telling that hotline they didn't want to be deployed to point guns at citizens. Military personnel telling that hotline they, quote, didn't want to be on the side of being armed occupiers in their own country. The New York Times reported the troops recoiling from Trump's use of them in Los Angeles. In more pungent terms, quote, at least 1 company commander and 1 battalion commander who objected to the mission were reassigned to work unrelated to the mobilization. Some troops became so disgruntled that there were several reports of soldiers defecating in Humvees and in the showers at the Southern California base where the troops are stationed, prompting tightened bathroom security. Tightened bathroom security. Despite that military triumph in Los Angeles, we've now got Trump using military bases now all over the country to hold massive new immigrant prison camps, which he is planning on military bases at Fort Bliss in Texas and Camp Atterbury in Indiana and Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst in New Jersey. Trump has also expanded huge swaths of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona into what he's calling, quote, military zones, in which he's legally expanded the boundaries of local military bases into huge hundreds of miles long territories, where he's now given U.S. active duty troops the instruction and authority to stop and search and arrest Americans on domestic U.S. soil. Watch what they do, not what they say. He wants U.S. military force deployed on U.S. soil facing inward as a show of force to the American people about what he and the government can do to you. People in D.C. are already protesting against it. This was just today. Just as people in Los Angeles protested against it when Trump tried it there as well. This weekend, people protested in Los Angeles against ongoing immigration raids and arrests there. Those protests have not stopped in Los Angeles, with or without the National Guard and the Marines there to try to scare everyone into not protesting. People protested in Columbus, Ohio this weekend as well. Hands along High Street, they called it. Protest in Columbus, Ohio, where protesters lined the streets for 8 solid miles, protesting against what Trump is doing. This woman in Florida is 104 years old. She has been protesting every week, every Thursday with her neighbors and friends. Her sign in this picture says here, girls just want to have fun. Ding for scientific research. She's 104. She'll be 105 years old this week. And she is protesting against the Trump administration 1 out of her every 7 days. What are you doing with your life, you spring chicken? When Donald Trump sent troops to Los Angeles this summer on the absurd pretext that some kind of war was on, Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass and other LA officials didn't just protest against it and try to stop it. They also warned the country that, yeah, he's doing this to us first, but it's going to be you next. They were clear-eyed about that. They were right. And we, clearly, are now in the part of the attempted authoritarian takeover where our authoritarian leader just starts trying to turn our own military to face us, the people of this country. And the questions that are equally important in response to that right now are, number one, what will the troops do about that? And number two, what will we do?
The Wall Street Journal reports this, quote, a generation ago, conventional wisdom held that as China liberalized, its economy would come to resemble America's. Instead, capitalism in America is starting to look like China. The Journal is referring to what it describes as state capitalism, a hybrid between socialism and capitalism, in which the state guides the decisions of normally private enterprises, end quote. We're watching that happen in action in front of our eyes, as News on Friday revealed that makers of AI chips, NVIDIA and AMD, have agreed to pay the U.S. government 15% of their revenue from sales in China. Washington Post reports on how that's being received. Quote, in addition to the policy problems, the U.S. Constitution flatly forbids export taxes, said Peter Harnell, the White House senior director for international economics under the Biden administration, in a Sunday post on social media. Christopher Padilla, a top export control official in the George W. Bush administration, echoed those fears. Quote, export controls are in place to protect national security, not raise revenue for the government, Padilla said. The arrangement seems like bribery or blackmail or both, end quote. So you got a Biden guy and a Bush guy who don't think it's a very good idea. But as Donald Trump extends more state power over markets and wreaks havoc on the global trade system with his tariffs and cuts taxes for the billionaires with his party's latest big, beautiful bill, he's betraying his own voters. He's betraying his central campaign promise to make life more affordable in the United States of America. In a recent AP poll, only about 1/4 of U.S. adults think his policies are helping them. That survey finds that roughly half say his policies have, quote, done more to hurt them. Annie Lowrey at The Atlantic calls Trump a degrowther. She writes, quote, without admitting it, the White House is pursuing a multi-pronged strategy to raise prices, suppress consumption, freeze production, and lower productivity in the U.S., Unlike typical degrowthers with their focus on long-term human flourishing and the conservation of the planetary ecosystem, Trump is engaged in financial nihilism. The president has at least once admitted that his policies will lead to Americans having less instead of more. Quote, maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30, you know? And maybe the $2 will cost a couple of bucks more than they would normally, end quote. If only pricier dolls were the worst of it. Trump's broken promise of a strong economy and his ultimate betrayal of the MAGA voter is where we begin the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Michigan, Justin Wolfers, is back. Also joining us, New York Times opinion writer, MSNBC contributor Mara Gay is here, and Princeton University professor, MSNBC contributor Eddie Glaude joins us. Justin, so much of what passed as passable or tolerable, or what was laundered in Trump 1.0 on the op-ed pages of the Wall Street Journal was the he's bad but part of Trumpism. You know, he's bad for firing Comey, but the economy's hot. He's bad for norms, but he's good for the economy. He's bad for the rule of law. He's bad for Russia's, ability to control the right-wing MAGA conversations around Russia, but he's good for the economy. He's obliterated all the buts. He is destroying the U.S. economy. He's going to hurt people who put their economic anxiety and hopes in him. Why?
Why? I think none of us know. There you might need a psychiatrist, not an economist. But it's definitely occurring. And I think the thing that makes it all the harder is it's occurring in slow motion. For instance, all the hullabaloo about tariffs blew up in April, but they really only went into effect 3 days ago. And so we're finally going to see the effect in a couple of months' time. If you think about the far deeper things, the things you were just talking about, which is the centralization of power in the White House, the movement away from markets towards a command and control economy, that's the sort of thing that slows down economic growth over a generation, not over a day, a week, or a year. And so if I were forced to answer your why question, what we're seeing here is not an economic theory. What we're seeing is someone who loves power. The problem with centralizing power is we do have economic theories about that. That's a command and control economy. If NVIDIA wants to do work, they have to call the White House. If Coke wants to figure out how much sugar to put in their beverage, they have to call the White House. If Harvard wants to know who to hire next, they have to call the White House. If Intel wants to know who the next CEO is, they have to call the White House, and on and on and on it goes.
Let me ask you to explain what it means now that we have, as you said, the tariff debacle is a slow motion car crash, I think we can call it. But this is where, according to the Yale Budget Lab, as of August 7th, consumers face an overall average effective tariff rate of 18.6%, the highest since 1933, which is obviously significant for folks who watch and warn about tariffs. What does that mean for shoppers, and especially back-to-school shoppers who are really out there right now?
Well, it means that as you go to the store, you're going to start to see, you're starting to see a little bit, but you'll see even more of these prices creeping up and up and up. And look, many of my friends on the right say, well, if you want to avoid paying tariffs, buy American. Here's the problem with that. As soon as, for instance, Samsung raises their price on imported washing machines because they have to pay the tariffs, do you know what General Electric does? The American-made washers go up just as quickly. And we're already seeing the same thing happening with cars and across the board. So this is something that's going to undermine a range of industries, and not just foreign goods, because a lot of American-made goods are made with imported raw materials. They're made with imported machinery and so on. The one thing I want to remind you of, and this is why it matters so much more than any previous inflation, when we had inflation during the pandemic, it's the form of inflation where prices go up, therefore, the boss has got a bit more money. Therefore, eventually, they'll lead your wage to go up. With tariffs, costs are going up. The boss has got no more money. You will not get a wage rise to help you catch up for this increase in the cost of living.
So, Mara, whether people are feeling that yet or understand all this yet, or have sort of heard the message loud and clear or not, isn't clear to me. But this is how people feel about grocery shopping. 86% of all Americans say grocery shopping is stressful for them. 53% say it's a major source of stress. 33% say it's a minor source of stress. Only 14% of all Americans say the cost of eggs and other groceries are not a source of stress for them. So it took him 6 months to completely betray almost 90% of all Americans.
That's right. And I think one of the reasons that you're seeing that data come out is that Americans have actually, for an entire generation now, and certainly over the past decade and a half, have seen their wages relatively stagnant and the cost of housing soaring. And so you have two fundamental problems underlying the American economy to begin with, which then makes the price of eggs an even more sensitive issue that hit voters and Americans with less money first. But you're going to see that penetrate into all classes in the country. You're already feeling that. It's also true that we know that the employment numbers are not as strong as we would like them to be. And so that means it's harder for Americans to move around and try and increase their income because Americans aren't getting raises from one company anymore. You have to move around to increase your income. So all of that frustration is making them even more sensitive, I believe, to what we see now happening with the tariffs. And again, as you mentioned, Nicole, with back to school shopping, it's going to be hitting hard. And then, of course, after that, it's the Christmas shopping season. So this is a lot of pain that Americans are in for, and they're already struggling with the fundamental costs of housing.
You know, Eddie, I missed that first term, but, right? I thought Trump was an abomination because he was elected after the country heard him say, brag about grabbing women between the legs. And he talked about Megyn Kelly bleeding from every orifice. And he called for Russia to release Hillary Clinton's emails. But it was better that people didn't suffer this economic pain. It is not good that 90% of Americans feel deep anxiety about grocery shopping, because when people feel anxiety, they feel angry. And when they're angry, they're awful, right? And part of the cycle of keeping Trump in power is keeping people aggrieved. And I wonder your thoughts on this economic destruction and this intentional infliction of economic insecurity on his own voters.
You know, first of all, it's always great to see you, Nicole. It's hard to wrap my mind around and disentangle it from emotions. We have to interrogate that but. You know, he did this, but at least he's this guy. I mean, we have to begin to see what exactly MAGA voters were actually desiring, what they were trying to hold off, and why they would believe, in so many ways, this carnival barker, that Donald Trump, how he behaves in the political sphere. So I think, the pain that people will feel, the difficulty that they're going to feel around the kitchen table will have an impact politically. I'm not sure what that will look like. But I do remember this, Nicole, just going back to how you opened up. I remember being on Morning Joe, and Alan Greenspan, the former chair of the Fed, was on. And we were talking about China. And I remember asking him, I said, China's trying to make a case that capitalism does not require liberalism to work. And he turned to me and he looked me dead in my eye and he said, China will lose. And what's fascinating, I don't see what Donald Trump is doing as a kind of mirror of what China did, but it's certainly the case, right, that his effort to centralize power, that his effort to dismantle democracy proceeds on the assumption that capitalism and markets can work without liberal commitments and norms and principles. And so when I combine that with the reality of the economic impact, we are in deep, deep peril as a country, it seems to me.
New doubts that Ukrainian President Zelensky will be invited to take part in the upcoming summit with President Trump and Vladimir Putin on Friday. Here's what the president said just a short time ago.
I'm going to meet with President Putin, and we're going to see what he has in mind. And if it's a fair deal, I'll reveal it to the European Union leaders and to the NATO leaders and also to President Zelensky. I think out of respect, I'll call him first, and then I'll call them after. And I may say lots of luck, keep fighting, or I may say we can make a deal.
Well, the decision to even invite Putin is controversial, and so is the location, Alaska, a former Russian territory. The setting being celebrated by Russian nationalists who have long believed it was a mistake for Moscow to have given up Alaska, much like how Putin rused the loss of Ukraine. NBC's Yamiche Alcindor covers the White House for us. Also with us, Mark Polymeropoulos, former CIA chief of operations in Europe and Eurasia and an MSNBC national security and intelligence analyst. Welcome both. Yamiche, what more did we hear from the president about this summit?
Well, the big question coming into the room was he going to have the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, at the table? We had heard from sources that he was considering and making the invitation to President Zelensky, but ultimately President Trump made it very clear that this is going to be a bilateral meeting between him and Vladimir Putin. He said, in fact, that after they meet, he will then maybe call the president of Ukraine and see if there can then be a trilateral meeting between him, President Zelensky, and President Putin. But it's really interesting because President Zelensky has said no sort of peace deal can be brokered without Ukraine at the table. The president also was very interesting today in really reiterating that he believes that there needs to be a swapping of territories. That was the language that President Trump used today. The big question is he essentially going to demand that Ukraine give up part of its territory? President Zelensky says that the Ukrainian constitution doesn't allow them to do that. But the president then said, well, you know what? President Zelensky needs to get around his own constitution because if a deal needs to be made, a deal needs to be made. The president also said he'll know within the first 2 minutes of sitting down with Vladimir Putin if a deal can be made. When he was asked, well, how would you know that? He said, well, I'm somebody who knows how to make deals, so I just know that it'll be essentially his gut telling him. So we're definitely going to be watching very closely what happens on Friday and then also what happens subsequently, because we'll know, it seems like in pretty short order, whether or not there's a sort of movement toward peace or whether President Trump might throw up his hands and say continue fighting. Chris?
Well, Mark, let me play for you exactly what Donald Trump just said about Zelensky.
Volodymyr Zelensky is not invited on Friday?
He wasn't a part of it. I would say he could go, but he's gone to a lot of meetings. You know, he's been there for 3.5 years. Nothing happened.
I wonder what you make of a summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin that excludes one party that would need to be needed to make peace.
Well, Chris, first of all, this is a summit that's based on the false notion that Russia is willing to make any deals. Remember, Steve Witkoff, the envoy, went to Moscow, and after that, total confusion reigned. He came back. There needed to be multiple clarifications. Somehow he reported that Putin may be willing to give up some territory. The Russians then came back, said they were not, and the Europeans and the Ukrainians became quite alarmed. And I think they're going to be more alarmed, frankly, after today, where Trump was seemingly blaming Zelensky for the war, which is preposterous. But also, it looks like he's just winging it. You know, he's going just to sit down to Putin to take his temperature. That's usually not the way summits go. So in some ways, you always want the Ukrainians to be responsible for their own negotiations. But, you know, if Zelensky was there right now for this initial meeting, I think the worry is that both Russia, both Putin and Trump are going to gang up on him. Because remember, Trump just wants a deal for this, you know, his grand prize, which is to get a Nobel. A bad peace is going to be much worse. That's what the Ukrainians are very worried about. I think after the press conference today, there's going to be much more alarm in Kyiv and in Europe.
Well, Trump's national security advisor, as I'm sure you've heard, Mark, John Bolton, he's among the experts who has been very critical of this summit. If people haven't heard it, let me play it.
I think Trump has made some mistakes already. Number one, in holding this meeting on American soil, legitimizing a pariah leader of a rogue state. But what Putin gets more than anything else is an opportunity one-on-one to try and get his magic working again with Trump, applying that KGB training, whether intentionally or unintentionally. He pushed Trump further than Trump wanted to be pushed, and you saw the reaction. What Putin wants to get back, he's not so worried about the sanctions. He wants the relationship back with Trump.
So you heard what the former national security advisor said, essentially two parts. One, it's obviously Putin, he believes, who's getting the better deal here. And watch to see what he does in terms of using his KGB training. Would you agree with what John Bolton is saying?
I absolutely agree with John Bolton saying, you know, Putin is a very wily veteran intelligence officer. I think he has, a book on Trump in terms of a psychological profile. He's going to know how to manipulate him.
Well, can we also just say when was it? Days, weeks ago, suddenly we went from it was going to be more sanctions against Russia to, oh, come on over, we'll have a meeting.
Right. So who's going to show up? Is it the Trump who is being a little bit tougher on Russia, allowing the U.S. to sell weapons to the European allies who then could pass them on to the Ukrainians? Or is it going to be the Trump of the first term? Who really detested Zelensky and the Ukrainians. Let's not forget the 2018 Helsinki summit, Chris. I think we all have post-traumatic stress from that when our own Jonathan Lemire asked that famous question about Russian interference in 2016, and Trump sided with the Russians on this against the intelligence community. The great worry is that when Putin gets Trump in a room, he's going to use his old intelligence training to flatter. And these are some things that Trump seems to like. And then you're going to have a press conference when the concern is that Trump kind of gives away the farm in terms of Ukraine. I don't see any national security professional, apolitical professional, who thinks this is going to turn out well on Friday in Alaska. I think there really is great concern.
Mark Polymeropoulos, Yamiche Alcindor, thank you both.
For Donald Trump. This bogus latest attack, this bogus latest call for me to be prosecuted or to be jailed is not going to deter me. I'm going to continue to hold Donald Trump accountable for his corruption, for his malfeasance, for the terrible harms he's doing to this country. You can count on it.
That was Democratic Senator Adam Schiff of California back in July when President Donald Trump initially accused him of mortgage fraud. Well, now Attorney General Pam Bondi has appointed a so-called special attorney to investigate mortgage fraud allegations against Senator Schiff, as well as New York Attorney General Letitia James. Two administration's officials told NBC News that Bondi has named conservative activist and former interim U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C., Ed Martin, as special attorney to investigate two prominent Democratic opponents of President Trump. A senior law enforcement official revealed a grand jury seated in the Eastern District of Virginia will investigate fraud allegations against James, while a grand jury in Maryland will look into Schiff. Trump has previously called for both Democratic officials to be prosecuted, but Schiff and James have denied any wrongdoing. An attorney for James called the investigation, quote, the most blatant and desperate example of political retribution by the Trump administration. Schiff's lawyer called the allegations, quote, transparently false and criticized Ed Martin as brazenly partisan. Joining us now, NBC News senior executive editor for national security, David Rode. I guess fair to point out that Donald Trump promised retribution against his political or perceived rivals all during the campaign, loudly, and very transparently. And here we go. But what more can you add to this reporting, David? And what does it portend for others?
I think more investigations. Over the weekend, I spoke to a half dozen former DOJ and FBI officials and legal experts, and all of this is unprecedented. One small thing. So Ed Martin is going to be called a special attorney. This is not a special counsel. A special counsel was, Robert Mueller. A special counsel is chosen because of their independence and their, judgment that they make the final decisions. This is a tightly controlled tightly controlled investigation, very compartmentalized, controlled by a loyalist to Donald Trump. Robert Mueller, and a lot of this is trying to rewrite history, concluded that there was not enough evidence to bring a prosecution that Trump had colluded or his campaign had colluded with Russia. That was a brave, independent decision that frustrated many Democrats at the time. This is completely different. A special attorney does exactly what the attorney general asked them to do. So we're talking about Letitia James and Adam Schiff now, but I see more investigations in the future using this same approach.
And can you explain what this means for the people being investigated? So Adam Schiff, back in July, might have been saying, I'm going to fight ahead, and Letitia James as well. What costs does this incur for them? What pain does this inflict on them, given this choice to use this special attorney to investigate them?
There'll be a financial cost in terms of they have to defend themselves in court, but to be honest, it might help them politically. Donald Trump used the fact that he was prosecuted to help him. The real concern are many other people, FBI and DOJ agents, who this basically tars them. And this is all backwards. Investigations are supposed to be secret. The power of the federal government is not to name and shame people. That is what Ed Martin said he was going to do as the head of the weaponization group. So it's those people who are effectively being silenced. They will be afraid to investigate corruption in the Trump administration, the second Trump administration. And that's really the broad problem here. It's intimidation. It's naming people before they've been indicted by a grand jury for committing any crime. So that's what's so troubling about what's happening.
David, it's clear this is a case of retribution, but can you talk a little bit about the merits of the actual case and the legal case here? In particular, this use of the Civil Rights Act to go after AG Letitia James.
Yeah, she's got two cases against her. One is mortgage fraud, and then there's this violation of rights. And that's an allegation, she hasn't been indicted yet, that she violated Donald Trump's rights by investigating him last year. She famously, found evidence, and a judge agreed that he had overvalued or undervalued his property by billions of dollars to save money. And the judge ruled that he should pay a $500 million fine, $500 million. That infuriated Donald Trump. That's a very broad statute that can be used, and it's normally used by excessive force by police officers based on race or gender or religion. It's now being used against anyone, it seems, who has investigated Donald Trump.
As though he's a protected class.
Yes, but it's just all of this is so unusual. There was so much post-Watergate reform to have independent counsels and that they would operate on their own and in secret and not be just smearing people. But that's where we are, and I just think we're going to see more and more of this tactic.
Yeah.